Hey you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 14, season 2. What an exciting episode I have for you this week. It's with Pam Dawling of Twin Oaks Community Farm in Louisa, Virginia. Pam is kind of a legend in the market gardening world. She wrote the book Sustainable Market Farming, and more recently her last book was The Year-Round Hoop House, both of which are incredibly useful books. In particular, if you live further in the South, those planting dates are actually really helpful. They're both great. You should pick up a copy of both of them. She's written for Growing for Market magazine, and she keeps a weekly blog at sustainablemarketfarming.com. You don't have to memorize all that. I will hook it up with some links in the show notes, but Pam and I today talk about the gardens there that she managed for over 20 years. She just recently retired. She gives a really great bed turnover tip that I love involving flags, which will make sense when you hear it. And then a lot of the conversation is talking about the community she lives in, which itself is also kind of legendary, but is also the only market the garden really supplies. So we kind of talk about how all that works, because I know I was super curious. So I'm very excited to bring it to you, but I could not bring it to you without the support of BCS America.
BCS two-wheeled tractors are often referred to as the best tiller on earth, which makes sense given that the rear tine tiller is our most popular attachment. Recently, a growing number of folks have begun to see till as a dirty word. No-till and low-till methods certainly have their benefits, but the BCS tiller attachment has a new trick up its sleeve for growers that are concerned with inverting soil layers or over-pulverizing their soil. The Precision Depth Roller accessory, or PDR, is now available for 30-inch BCS tillers, and a 26-inch version will be available in early 2020. The PDR gives BCS owners precise control over the depth at which they engage their soil, from half an inch up to 7 inches deep in half-inch increments. Perfect for mixing in soil amendments while chopping up any leftover plant residues. And the PDR's expanded mesh roller gently levels the soil, leaving behind a perfect seedbed. The PDR is on sale now. Check out bcsamerica.com for sale pricing and to find your nearest dealer.
Big thanks to BCS America. All right, enough from me. Let's get to our amazing conversation with Pam Dawling of Twin Oaks Community Farm. Pam Dawling, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I'm glad to have you. I'm such a fan of your work, which, with much love to our northern growers, you've been one of the few market gardening resources actually kind of located in our region, in my growing region. So I'm super excited to talk about some of the things you have going on there. But first, maybe you could just kind of calibrate us a little bit and give us an idea of, what Twin Oaks Community Farm looks like, what sort of size and scale you're working with over there.
Sure, yeah. We're an intentional community of 100 people, and the food that we produce here is all for this community of 100 people. So as far as the gardening goes, we're growing vegetables on 3.5 acres, but we also have a dairy program, poultry, bees, and a farm program, which is mostly producing hay for our cattle and for mulch in the garden. So we have about 500 acres altogether, but most of it is woods. I should say, and most of it is wood.
Okay, so those 100 people live on that 500-acre community.
Yes, that's right.
Or a 500-acre plot. Okay, so I'd like to hear a little bit more about this community. Can you tell us a little bit, give us the rundown of the Twin Oaks community and how it started and sort of how it functions?
Sure. Well, Twin Oaks started in 1967 with that Back to the Land kind of movement. But unlike some other communities that have come and gone, Twin Oaks decided to be very clear and specific about the agreements between members and to be egalitarian, and that everybody gets a chance to give their input on important matters, important decisions. And so we're still here, and as well as being egalitarian, we are a secular group. We have no group religion. You can believe what you like. We don't have a leader. We don't all have to be vegan or anything like that. People can choose their diet, more or less. We have cooks who cook for us twice a day. People can just show up for meals. We do have a work agreement, labor credit system, where everybody is required to work at least a certain amount each week. And that, I think, has been one of our strengths in that it holds us. We all know that everybody here is doing their fair share. And so that takes off a lot of the wondering that can happen otherwise. We cover all ages. We've got some pretty young babies, and our oldest people currently are kind of 75 or so. We want diversity of race. We don't have as many people of color as we would like to have living here, but it's a growing group.
Yeah, that's great. So how did you kind of come to find this community?
Well, in the sort of communities world, Twin Oaks is pretty famous, and I was living in similar sorts of communities in the UK, but they were much smaller, and I really liked the idea of living with a big group of people, and so I came to visit to find out if it would really work for me, because it's all very well thinking, I'd love to live with 100 people, but until you experience it, you don't know if you're really suited or not. So I came to visit, and I really liked it. It was a big change for me to leave my good friends in the UK and to move here, but I haven't regretted it, and I think I intend to live here until I die.
That's great. So did you come with a sort of agricultural background at all, or did that kind of start when you arrived at Twin Oaks?
Oh, I had definitely done quite a bit of agricultural stuff before. Certainly lots of gardening, vegetable gardening, but also because the communities were smaller, we kind of took turns at more of the jobs. So I was also used to milking cows and goats and doing a bit of tractor work in the fields, keeping bees, poultry of different kinds. Yeah, I'd done all that sort of stuff for, 15, 16, 17 years. So I had quite a bit of experience, but Virginia is a different climate from England, and there are different bugs and different plants and some different crops and plenty of different weeds. So I still had plenty to learn.
Yeah, that's great. So in this community, you said it's sort of egalitarian, everybody gets kind of a say. How does that work? Is it like a weekly meeting, or is it something that is just a regular, or is it more casual than that? Like, how does that work?
Oh, thank goodness we don't have weekly meetings. I would dread that. The decision-making is quite decentralized. Most of the decisions are being made by whoever is the manager of a certain area. So for a long time, for instance, I was the manager of the vegetable garden. So I would make the decisions about what we grew, what the crop rotation was, when we planted, when we harvested, who worked in the garden and who didn't, and all that kind of stuff. And if anybody had a problem with it, they could come and talk to me, or they could appeal my decisions if they really thought I wasn't listening and I was on the wrong track. But we leave it up to the managers to make the decisions about stuff in their areas. And then we have a group of people we call planners. There's usually 3 of them. They're served for 18 months each. And they make the sort of bigger, wider, longer term kind of decisions that don't fit within any managerial area.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was thinking, I guess I made an assumption, considering how much you've written on market gardening and those sorts of things, that you kind of had a garden of your own, and that was something that was sort of at the community. But it sounds like the garden itself is kind of part of the community, like it's the community's garden. Would that be accurate?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, it's the community's garden. And, 2 years ago, I decided I wanted to retire from being the manager, and so I handed over to somebody else who's now the manager. And I still work, I'd work in a hoop house and the greenhouse in the spring, doing the seedlings and special projects. And I'm welcome to join in whenever I want. So it's worked out nicely. But yeah, it is a community's garden. So all the food that is grown belongs to the community. It's a bit like a CSA farm in the sense that the people, or would be the clients or the customers, although they're not paying any money, they are receiving whatever it is we grow, and then hopefully we'll use it. It's like one big box. So CSA with one big box. There's kind of one model.
Wow, that's so neat. Okay, and it's a little bit challenging to my general view of my wife and I own our farm and we produce a product and we sell it to people.
Right.
I'm curious, what is how does the monetary aspect of it work? Is there a salary involved with being a manager?
Nope.
Do you all sell the vegetables outside of the farm?
Nope, none of the above. We don't use money internally, so we share the income that we earn from our businesses, and we share our expenses that are needed, like to run the farm and for individuals to go to the doctor or to buy some clothes or whatever they need. So we work all that out, and the labor credit, the work system, is really how we make the exchange between one person and another. I was trying to explain it to, there's an 8-year-old here, and he didn't really understand about money, and he said, well, why don't they have labor credits like in the rest of the world? Indeed.
Yeah, that's so... Okay, so then what are some of the other businesses that actually generate revenue for the community then? Is it stuff that's being produced on those 500 acres that are being sold outside of the community? Is that kind of where any additional revenue comes from?
Right, yes. We have a business making and selling organic tofu, and one making hammocks. That's the sort of oldest of our businesses, I think. And then some smaller ones. Some people write indexes for books. Some people run a business growing seed crops and selling those. It's another part of our farm. And also there's one person who does cut flowers, another part of our farm, but it also is a business. We work with Southern Exposure Seed Exchange that is quite nearby, and some people here pack seeds and sell them to stores that have racks in the store, and they want packets of certain varieties. And so some people at Twin Oaks do that. And then there's a few lesser things, like the money from my books and any presentations I get paid for. That is community income.
Wow, that is so interesting. That's so amazing. I love that. So, so this book, it's great because I love these sort of challenging concepts that we have grown up and lived in a sort of capitalistic society my whole life. So, so yeah, these sort of communities. Would that be an accurate term? I don't even know if commune is that an accurate term?
It is an accurate term. We sort of tend to say intentional community more often these days because sometimes people have bad ideas about commune that we want to dissociate ourselves from. But we are a commune, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that was kind of my thinking. Is there some sort of connotation there that makes it seem, I don't know, not as serious as it is? But this is like a really cool and serious thing that you're doing, and it's interesting because I really love the year-round Hoop House, the book that you wrote, but it's so interesting to hear that you actually shared that income and that anybody else that's living there is actually also sharing that income.
That's right, yeah.
While we're on this subject, could you talk a little bit about, are there challenges with getting that set up? Does it tend to be everybody's just agreed on this and then you're sharing those incomes and that sort of thing, or is there some tension there ever?
Well, there's a big difference between starting a new community and joining an existing one. When people come to join Twin Oaks, they need to accept our policies and our membership agreements. They can seek to change things if they want, but changing 100 people is not so easy, really. So sometimes that can be a challenge for newish people. They come in with rosy spectacles and everything's great for a while, and then they say, I really don't like this aspect and I want to change it. But it can be hard to change things here because you've got to convince a lot of people. But that makes it, in other ways, it makes it nicer for people to stay here long term because you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time a new person joins.
Right. It's probably been developed since 1967. So the sort of systems are already well in place. It would be like coming onto a farm that's been going for that long, that you can kind of hop into the systems and start understand the program.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So I want to kind of get into some of the farm management stuff that you've done. So talk a little bit. Maybe we can combine this a little bit with the community stuff, because you said there's 100 people and that's primarily where the food is going. Can you talk about how that works? Like, is there a harvest schedule? Is everybody chipping in on the garden, or is there like a set group that kind of works under that manager? Any insight there would be interesting.
Right. Although we do require that everybody does at least a certain amount of work each week, people can choose what kind of work they like to do, more or less. I mean, sometimes you can't get the job of your dreams right away. But it does mean that we don't have people doing jobs that they don't want to be doing, which is often a recipe for disaster. So the people that work in the garden have all chosen to work in the garden, and they've chosen their level of participation. I mean, sometimes we need lots of people to harvest the sweet potatoes. There's some kind of announcement like that, and so people, I guess, feel a bit of sort of moral pressure to turn out and harvest the sweet potatoes. But generally, people can choose. Individual people can choose. And so the garden and other areas all benefit from having some of the same people. Sort of, it's not really specializing. We're not quite that. Hardly anybody has a full-time job in any one area, because most people really like the variety. People like to work a bit in one place and a bit in another. So it's a balance between the specialization and experience and the novelty. Lost track of the rest of the question.
No, I know. I kind of grouped two questions in there together that were very different. But the other question is kind of, how do you manage, let's just go with harvests. So there's 2 meals a day that are kind of communal, right? And then you're having to harvest presumably for those meals. So how is that managed? Is there just like 1 weekly harvest or 2 weekly harvests?
No, 6 days a week. The garden crew harvests whatever's ready to harvest. I mean, obviously they don't go out and harvest all the kale on one day, but they would harvest, say, 10 gallons of kale, because that would be about the right amount for one meal for 100 people. And whatever's ripe of the things that become ripe and then go bad, and then take them to the kitchen. We have a big walk-in cooler. Put the food in there, and maybe if you see the cooks, you can talk with the cooks and say, I just brought you all this eggplant or whatever. But often by that point in the day, the cooks have already they've looked already in the walk-in, seen what's already there. They maybe have a plan already. So the vegetables you just harvested might turn out to be for the next day. So really, it's more like once a year. Actually, today, this afternoon, the crew is getting together to review how the past year has gone, and which crops did well, and which ones there was too much of, and which ones there wasn't enough of. And that will help tweak the planting plan and the seed order for next year's crops. And so there's a kind of standing schedule of what to plant and therefore what to harvest. But it can get changed each year a bit according to what was successful and what wasn't.
Yeah, that's great. In terms of like what percentage of that food is coming off the farm, like how much of the food that you all are eating is coming from the farm?
Well, the produce, we have had some years where we were able to grow just about everything except onions. But lately we haven't been able to do that. Well, partly the transition. I had a lot of experience and I could use that to help prevent disasters. But now I'm not out there every day. There's a bit of learning curve happening. And so not all the produce we want to eat is coming from the garden now. It could be a game. There's enough space to do that for sure. But we need the human energy, and to some extent we need people to grow in experience and to have more experienced people join in so that it's efficient and productive, and that any problems are nipped in the bud.
Yeah, and then you're growing throughout the year. You're growing all winter as well?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, growing all winter as well. Yeah. The other aspects of the farm, we produce all our own dairy products that we need, and beef. We don't produce all our own eggs. We eat a lot of eggs, and it would take a lot of chickens, which we don't yet have. But maybe one day we could, yeah.
And then, I mean, how much space? You said it was roughly 3.5 acres in vegetable production. How much of that space is undercover, is in sort of hoop house tunnel production?
Well, it's 3.5 acres without the hoop house, the tunnel. We've only got the one. It's 30 feet by 96 feet, but super productive.
Well, one question I kind of have, this is such an interesting conversation to me because I have a very strong love for collaborative farming. When you were managing the tunnels or managing the gardens versus now, does the sort of production system change a lot based on who's managing it, or has it always kind of been managed the same way?
It can definitely change. Each manager can add their own flavor to what they're doing and their own emphasis on what they think is most worthwhile. But working within the community, you do need to listen to what people want. And that's part of this crop review process that I described earlier, is that the rest of the community has also been asked, what about what we grew this year did you like? What would you like to be different next year? And so everybody can give their input on that, but then ultimately it's the garden manager that makes the decisions. But of course it has to work for the crew as well, the garden crew.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I'm curious about, in the book you talk a little bit about some of the no-till stuff you've done in the tunnel. Can you describe some of those trials and some of the different ways you've reduced your tillage and how the tunnels came into play on that?
Yes. When we decided to get the tunnel, it's 2003, we wanted to try no-till. We didn't want to be in there with exhaust fumes for us and the vegetables. We used to walk behind rototiller, but we decided not to do that in there. We wanted to see if we could just do a no-till in a sort of defined, specific area, and it's worked very well for us. One advantage was that we're not turning up new weed seeds by not turning the soil, and so when I came to write my book, The Year-Round Hoop House, I originally was going to have a chapter about weed control, but I was running oversize on the book, and so I locked out that chapter because I thought, you don't get many weeds in a hoop house, and everyone knows what to do about weeds, so this chapter can go. And I've since discovered that some growers who either open up the ends of their tunnels and run the tractors through, or use a walk behind rototiller, do in fact have serious weed problems. I managed to avoid those. We managed to avoid those. But we did find, as time went on, that the soil did compact. It just sort of slumped down. And so, the way we discovered this was that we designed our hoop house for maximum growing space, which means minimum walking space. And our feet often strayed into the edges of the beds. And so one year when we were getting ready to plant the fall and winter crops, we decided we would loosen up the edges of the beds by going along with a digging fork and getting rid of our footprints and so on. And then we noticed, after we sowed some spinach, that the spinach rows on the edges of the beds were doing so much better than the ones in the middle. And we decided that we needed to aerate the soil in the middles of the beds as well. So we got a broad fork, and we used that just once a year without turning the soil over, just loosening it up. And that's worked very well for us.
Yeah, that's cool. So can you describe a little bit, when you say you kind of stopped tilling in there, was there any sort of cover material involved on the soil, or was it just you still kind of had the blank soil, but that you were just not turning it over?
Well, we pretty much keep it planted up with vegetable crops or summer cover crops. We keep it planted up the whole year round. which does mean we can't use as many cover crops as we would like, as we do outdoors, for instance. But we never have tilled in there. And we've really got 3 vegetable seasons in there. We've got the fall and winter stuff that we plant in September, October, and that we're harvesting till April. And then we plant early tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and squash in middle of March or early April down the middles of the beds. And then those are in place until the end of July. And then we take those out and we plant. Usually we try to plant some kind of legume. And we've done seed crops of edamame and southern peas. And we've also done summer cover crops, like we've done cowpeas as southern peas as a cover crop. And we've also used, we've been battling nematodes. So we've done French marigolds and sesame plants in the summer in one bed.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so you're not necessarily using those tunnels for a lot of vegetable production during the summer. It's more of keeping it covered with plants and in beneficial ways like nitrogen fixers and anti-nematode stuff like
yes,
the marigold.
we used to focus more. I mean, initially we were growing food crops. We were growing the southern peas to harvest as a food crop, and then we decided it would be more benefit to us to grow it as a seed crop because the pods of legumes inside the hoop house are so beautiful and unblemished. You get really high quality seed, and we could sell that seed. And we moved over to that instead of harvesting in there. It was a bit hot to harvest in there. So we moved more towards, after that, we moved more towards using just a cover crop. But we could change again, I don't know.
Sure. In those seeds, that's going over to the southern exposure?
Yeah, we did.
Okay, cool. Are you doing, generally speaking, like in the fields, are you doing I remember you, maybe, forgive me if you said this already, but I know you said that people will go over there and help. Are you doing a lot of seed production for them?
Well, we have a business here, which is growing seeds for southern exposure, but also for other small seed companies. I think they've grown for Fedco and High Mowing and Baker Creek and some of the other small seed companies. So True, maybe. But that is a separate group of people, and they, because of the isolation required for growing seeds and so on, they use a separate piece of farmland that's a few miles away from where the vegetable gardens are.
Oh, okay, cool. That's like that's a completely separate operation, but still, is it still on those 500 acres?
It is, yes. I mean, it's separate, but we cooperate. You know, we ask the garden people, ask the seeds growing people, which bell peppers are you growing this year, or which bell pepper are you growing this year? And then if they're growing an orange one, we wouldn't grow an orange one in the garden, for instance, because with some of the crops, like peppers, you can harvest the crop, cut the peppers open, scoop out the seeds, and then you kind of get a double crop. You get the seed crop and you get the vegetable crop.
Yeah, sure. That's great. Have you spent time working over at the seed garden?
I haven't. I thought I might, after retiring as garden manager, but I haven't yet found the time, although it does interest me.
So Tiffany Jackson, so we let our patrons ask questions of our upcoming guests when we can. And one of our patrons, Tiffany Jackson, asked me, she's a big fan of your work, and she wanted to know a little bit about how you go about doing soil amending, and also anything you'd have to say about turning over beds, especially maybe in those tunnels from one crop to another.
Okay, yeah. We do soil tests once a year in the fall, and then we study the results. If we need to lime, we do, although it's been very rare that we've needed to. Sometimes we've needed to add boron. We tend to run short on that. Mostly we get good test results, so we don't have to add a lot of specific amendments. We have a big pretty big, compost making operation that's for our garden. And the person that does that work makes really good compost, and so we use that. And then we also do as many cover crops as we can. Well, outdoors, we do a lot of cover crops, winter cover crops, and also if we get a gap in the summer, we'll do a short-term warm weather cover crop. So those are the main things. Oh, sometimes I mentioned the hay earlier. We sometimes use spoiled hay for mulch, and so that will also go into the soil. We don't buy in any fertility. We don't buy in chicken manure or anything like that.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so what are you using for compost and that sort of stuff? Is it just kitchen scraps and that sort of thing, or like?
Oh, right.
Where's that come from?
The ingredients for the compost. Well, because we make tofu to sell, we have large quantities of a byproduct which is called okara. It's a high nitrogen foodstuff. Well, you can eat it, but we have large quantities, as I said. It's damp, it's moist, it looks a bit like cottage cheese. And so we use a lot of that, and we use a lot of sawdust and wood chips. Some we get from our hammocks business, from making the wooden stretcher bars, and also our hanging chairs. So we have some of our own wood chips and sawdust, but we don't have enough. So we trade some okara with a neighboring commercial compost maker, organic commercial compost maker. And he's always driving around looking for carbon sources. And so he brings us some sawdust and wood chips, and we give him some okara. So we've got that trade going on. So those are big ingredients in our compost. And we do add in the kitchen scraps, and we add in sometimes crop debris if it's big and it's in the way in the garden. If we can't just work with it where it is, we take that to the compost as well. So all that goes in, and so we get really nice compost that's heated up well and doesn't throw a load of weed seedlings. It's very nice to use.
Yeah, that's interesting. So do you mentioned that you were trading for some of that compost. Is that something that's commonly done in the community, that you're trading for things that the community doesn't necessarily produce?
Yes and no. It's not common. We do have some other examples going on. We do trade yet more okara for pigs for pork. Well, for pigs, and then we have pork. We don't keep the pigs long term. Put it like that. We trade back and forth with some of the community where Southern Exposure Seed Exchange is located. It's called Acorn. It's about 7 miles from here, and we have a lot of informal trading back and forth there. You know, they'll say, "Got any spare lettuce?" and we'll do that, and then they'll provide us with something later on. But that's very informal. We don't track that and make sure we're getting a fair deal. It tends to just work out nicely.
Okay. So back to that question that Tiffany was sort of asking about bed flips. Like, what is in that tunnel, especially in those sort of no-till situation? What do you do to transition from one crop to another?
Right. Yes. So in September and October, we prepare the beds for the fall and winter crops, and we do that by clearing whatever crop was in there before, spreading compost over the surface, and then broad forking, and then raking, and then transplanting or sowing the winter crops, because they're smaller things, they're close spaced, and so on. But then when it gets to March, we run a tape measure down the middle of the bed, and we put a flag every 2 feet, and we harvest the greens that are kind of too close to the flag. And then we dig holes and put some compost in the hole and transplant the tomatoes and peppers and squash and cucumbers. And then as those plants grow, we gradually pull out the greens that are too close for comfort, particularly the ones on the south side. I mean, I think initially it helps to have the ones on the south side they provide a bit of shade to the brand new transplants. But then ultimately we clear away all the greens and leave the full space for the transplants to occupy the whole bed. When it comes to end of July or so, we pull out those plants. We usually take those to the compost pile. We get quite a lot of foliar diseases on the tomato plants, and we want to make sure that we can continue to grow tomato plants in that same hoop house every year, though in a different bed. And so we haul away the tomato plants and the squash plants and so on to the compost pile, and then we just rake over the soil and sow the southern peas or whatever it is we're going to be growing for the high summer. So we just once a year the broad forking, just once a year spreading compost over the whole bed, once a year composting the holes for transplants, and then once a year we've got some kind of legume to add in. We have sometimes grown buckwheat. If we've got a sort of 3-week or 4-week gap in the summer, or we're not ready to sow the high summer crop, we'll do buckwheat. And then we'll just pull it up when it starts to flower and just lie it down on the bed, and it disintegrates and goes back in to the soil.
Okay. I love that flag idea. I've done similar things where I kind of just transplant one crop into another, but I've never thought about preemptively putting the flag into those greens, cutting around that flag,
Right.
As you need to, and then taking that flag out and putting the tomato or the cucumber or whatever it may be inside of there. I really think that's a great idea.
Yeah, it works really well, especially because we're talking about March and early April when the greens outdoors are, the new things haven't really got going yet, not productively. They might be planted under row cover, but they're not producing yet. And the stuff that's overwintered, like the kale and the collards and the spinach, is maybe getting a bit picked over. And so it's really valuable to have the greens from the hoop house at that time of year. And so we get an extra 3 or 4 weeks of greens by planting into the middles rather than pulling them all up.
Right, and that's another advantage to not bringing a tiller in there or a tractor in there, is that you don't have to clear that entire bed.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's true.
Hey, you all, just jumping in here real quick to say that if you've not checked out our new live Q&A show, Growers Live, with host Josh Satin, it airs every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern with a new guest, many of whom have been on the show. We are working on getting the audio from those conversations available up at patreon.com/farmerjesse for the Patreon members, who also get to ask early questions of the guests. But this show airs on YouTube. So you go to YouTube, you type in No-Till Growers, you hit the subscribe so you get the updates. But it comes on every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. The link is in the show notes. You can go back and watch the interviews we've done so far if you're trying to figure out what I'm talking about. Done one with Charles Dowling, 10 Mothers Farm, Levity Farms, and Jared Smith. This upcoming Tuesday will be with Daniel Mays of Frith Farm. That will be Tuesday, December 3rd. So check that out. Remember, YouTube, type in No-Till Growers. That's us. Tuesdays live at 8 p.m. Eastern. Patrons get first dibs on questions. So get those in at patreon.com/farmerjesse. And another thing patrons get at certain levels, a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Benson Morris of Ben's Barn on YouTube. Cool guy. Dawson Mahalko, Isaac Buells, J.M. Fortier, Jeffrey Hayes, Kevin Keene, Ryan Gosser, Tiffany Jackson, Weaver Akers, William Henpen, Yannick LaPlante, and special shout out this week to Vanya from Callisto's Garden, who sent us an amazing Eat the Nutrient Rich shirt, which is pretty hilarious. Could make a good Christmas gift, just saying. That's Callisto's Garden. You can check them out. They're super cool. All right, don't forget to show your support at patreon.com/farmerjesse. The more we grow that page, the more we can do. So think about that. Back to Pam. Okay, so you mentioned the buckwheat. You were kind of pulling that out and dropping it on the bed. What are some of the other ways that you're sort of terminating those late summer cover crops? Is that sort of the strategy with all of them?
We sort of did that with the southern peas. We clipped them off above soil level because we wanted to leave as many of the nitrogen nodules in the soil as possible. Because, if you pull them up, some of the nitrogen nodules scrape off and stay in the soil, but some of them are still on the roots. and we didn't want to be taking them away. So we clipped them off above the soil, and then we left the tops of the plants lying on the bed until we needed to prepare that bed for the winter crops. And what we actually did was we then picked them up and dumped them on the next bed over that we weren't preparing that week. And we ended up with a big pile, like 4 beds over, I suppose. And meanwhile, the plants had been dropping their leaves and so on, and we were able to incorporate the leaves into the bed, but we couldn't incorporate the big viney stems. And so eventually we gathered them up and took them to the compost pile. But they had by that time dropped a lot of leaves, so we were able to incorporate some of the material.
Okay, that's great. So because I really want to get people inspired to buy this year-round hoop house book that you wrote, because I just think it's great, especially for people in our region.
Yes.
I kind of want to talk a little bit about building tunnels and some of the things that maybe you learned in building that tunnel or just working in that tunnel, and some of the things you learned writing your book, about what people should focus on when it comes to having a good tunnel. And in particular, I guess we could kind of start with a few things. I'm wondering if you could kind of detail how somebody goes about deciding which way to orient their tunnel, long ways, and then we can kind of work towards some of the other things that go into building a good high tunnel.
Right, yes. So ideally, when you're choosing a site, you need it fairly flat, although you can change that. You need it not to be shaded by buildings or trees. And so what we did was we took some of the stake flags and we walked around in the middle of the winter, eyeing up possible spots, and we measured and flagged them out. And then we looked to see what kind of shading we got or didn't get. And we chose based partly on that, also based on you want to have your tunnel somewhere where you can easily get to. You don't want it at the end of the back 40 or something. Probably you want water and electricity supplied there, so you don't want enormous trenches to dig. I'm a strong believer in having the east and west be the short ends and the north and south being the long sides, because you want to get the maximum possible sunlight in the winter for the greens. And it's not, you can easily deal by getting a large piece of shade cloth to put over the hoop house in the summer. You can easily deal with reducing the heat in the summer, but you do want to get the best you can for the winter. So I would go for the long south side being one of the long sides. And then a slight drop from end to end, about 1 foot and 100 feet. That will mean that if any excess rain or flooding or anything comes in, it has a way to escape. You definitely don't want a bowl shape. You can move the soil around in there if you need to. Of course, you want to build up good topsoil. You don't want to be exposing the subsoil. So then, choose the site, measure it out, see what fits. I would say, I was told, when you're putting up your first hoop house, put it in a place where there's room for a second one later, because as soon as you've got one, you'll want a second one. And there's definitely truth in that. So if you can do that, that's great. And then choose the biggest one that isn't ridiculous, really, because you can always use the extra space for storage if you really don't want to be growing vegetables in there. And the bigger the space, the more buffering there is of the temperature. You won't lose heat so fast at night if you've got a larger hoop house. And you can. There are many things you can grow, and it's so wonderful that you'll probably find you want to end up growing in the whole space. So that's it. I definitely recommend the Gothic arch shape over the half-round Quonset shape, because it's better at shedding rain and even rain, but snow and ice, and in standing up to strong winds. And also you get better height at the sidewalls where you might just want to be working. And you get the extra headroom in the middle gives a better air quality and circulation of air. So I would go with the Gothic arch. I would go with 2 layers of plastic. If you can get electricity there to inflate the gap between the layers, that gives you more thermal insulation and also strength against snow loads and wind loads. So I would definitely try that. If you can't get electricity to your site or you really, really don't want to, there is this material, I haven't used it. It's called solar wrap, and it's a bit like bubble wrap on steroids. But you do have to be careful. It comes on a roll, like 4 feet wide or 6 feet wide to fit the bow spacing. But you do have to be careful to get accurate bow spacing because you need to fasten a track over the bows to feed in the sheet material, the roll material. And if you've kind of gone a bit wavy with your bows when you put them up, or your helpers put them up, it might not work very well. So the alternative to the inflation is not necessarily simple, but it's an interesting one, and it's good to have a method for people that don't have electricity at their site. As far as choosing the framework, we went with a 4-foot bow spacing. I will admit I was a nervous Nelly about it falling down, collapsing under weight of snow or something, even here in Virginia. So 4-foot bow spacing, if you're a nervous Nelly like me, or if you're in a place that gets a lot of snow or high wind. And then choose one that has a strong frame and preferably some end wall bracing, some diagonal bracing at the end, and trusses across some sort of structure of the framework that goes across the middle, a crossways. Ours doesn't. We bought the bargain model back when we were buying ours. We were before the Nrcs grants. Nowadays, you can apply for a grant towards the cost of your hoop house, and that's a great thing. But we had to fund ours ourselves back then, and we chose one that didn't have crossways struts. It's still standing, but, given more money and a better chance, I would go with one with trusses.
Do you have any advice in terms of what kinds of films? Is there anything in that realm that you think is really important to focus on?
The standard film is 6 mil, which is 6,000th of an inch. It does need to be UV resistant, and they have a certain sort of stretchability and strength to them. You definitely don't want to go the false economy of buying construction plastic because it doesn't last in sunlight at all. But then you've got a million pieces of plastic to deal with when it falls apart. So definitely get real, genuine agricultural, horticultural hoop house plastic. There are special treatments you can get for the inner layer, and we've sometimes done that. You can get a treatment which is infrared reflecting that sort of holds in some more of the warmth by reflecting it back. You can get one called condensate control or dripless, and it's treated so that the water that condenses on the surface stays as a film, a mist kind of thing. It doesn't blob up into water bombs. If you get water bombs, it's not nice to be working in there. They fall down the back of your neck, and they also can land on your tender seedlings. So it's nice to have the condensate control. And the infrared, I think we sometimes use that and sometimes not, the infrared reflective stuff. I haven't done any scientific studies on it. I think it's probably worth getting, but I don't know for sure.
Interesting. And then are you all doing any extra heating of any sort?
No.
Or do you recommend it?
No, I wouldn't. I'd recommend choosing crops that can survive in the conditions you have in your hoop house. We started out, we didn't want to have inner tunnels at all, which is what they do in colder climates. You have wire hoops and some kind of road cover But we didn't want to do that. But then with climate change, we found that we started to get some colder winter temperatures. And so we do have rolls of row cover in there in the winter. And if it's forecast to be below 8 Fahrenheit outdoors, then we will pull those row covers over for the night and roll them up again in the morning.
Wow, so your tunnel will get you pretty good all the way down to 8 Fahrenheit?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's great. And you think that's a product primarily of the double wall or the double plastic, the double poly, or what do you think that contributes to that sort of heat retention?
Yeah, definitely the double poly is a big part of it. Also, the soil just stays warmer. The soil temperature doesn't drop as much as outdoors, and so the plants have warmer roots, and the air stays warmer. I mean, it is important in the winter to go and close it up before the sun drops down. You want to try and store a bit of warmth as well.
Yeah, sure. So now I'm kind of curious, just getting back to the community thing. You talked about orienting the tunnel of, somewhat close to you, not in your back 40. How did you all make that decision? Are the houses where people live kind of centralized, or how does that work?
We have, everybody gets their own bedroom in a house. Each person gets their own bedroom. So even if you're a couple, you get a room each in a building, which also has a bathroom and a sitting room, and the newer ones also have a small kitchen. And we have about 9 residence buildings, and some of them are clustered. The older ones are clustered in a courtyard, and then the newer ones are kind of along a ribbon development along one of our interior roads, driveways. So what we did when we wanted to put up the hoop house was we wrote a paper about it for the community to read, and we put out those flags that I mentioned so they could see where it would be. And we have a process, a land planning and space use process that we go through if someone wants to change the use of a space. It's going to impact everybody or a lot of people. So we filled out the form and we posted it. And some people commented and some people didn't really like it, but everybody really liked the idea of more fresh food in the winter. And we put it up, and it is, when I look at a hoop house, I think, oh, wonderful, all the food, all that healthy plants growing and how pleasant it is to work in there. But, they're not, I don't think they're beautiful to look at, really. And some people thought it was quite an eyesore. But ultimately, the community decided we could go ahead, and so we've done that, and it's worked out. It's worked out well. We did. We made the mistake of we had a site figured out, and then we decided it would be better if we moved it 100 feet east because the drainage would be better. And we failed to pay attention to the trees as well. And so we had to sort of go back later and say, we'd like to cut down these trees, please. And the community was agreeable. So it worked out in the end.
So was there, or generally speaking, is there a vote on these kind of things? Or is it sort of collection of the general sentiment? How does that work within the community?
Yeah, it's not a vote. We don't vote on much at all. We vote on somebody joining, or if we have to throw somebody out, which is extremely rare. So there's as I said earlier, there are managers of different areas that make the decisions about things in their area. And so we have someone who's the manager of this land planning and space use process. And their job is to see that you've correctly described the project and you've marked where you would have it be, and then they check to see what comments people have left on the paper, and if there's a lot of discontent or resistance, they'll come back to you and they'll say that your project is not getting general approval? Could you see if you can address any of these comments and change something about what you want to do and repost it? Or else they come to you and they say, oh, it looks like this will go ahead, and they send it on to the people, the planners who deal with the broader picture of what the community is, and they make the final decision. So that there is no vote, but that everybody gets a chance to say what they think. And then the people making the decision take all that into account.
Hey, you all, last interruption from me. Make sure to check out the event we have coming up in San Diego in February 2020 with Jared Smith of Jared's Real Food and Stephen Cornett of Nature's Always Right. We are offering through the month of December a 10% discount. That's right, 10% off tickets. It's the giving season, right? So 10% off tickets to everyone with the offer code JaredRight, JaredRight. This thing is going to be jammed with value, and it's going to be a blast. Invest in your education this winter. Come hang out with us in San Diego. That's no-tillgrowers.com/events and use that dang offer code. JaredRight, all lowercase, one word. All right, back to Pam. What about in terms of, you mentioned that the Nrcs grant wasn't really available to you all. How was the tunnel sort of funded by the community?
Well, we do a budgeting process once a year, and if anybody has an idea, well, actually, you can do this other times a year as well. If you have an idea of something which would be a fixed asset, something that would cost more than $2,000, say, I'm not quite sure of the numbers, and would last more than 5 years or something, you can ask for funding for that, and that money would come from our savings. And then we budget the rest of the money to spend on the day-to-day stuff. Okay.
And then in terms of like is the entire property already paid for and it's settled? Like, how does that work?
Yes, we own the land, we own the buildings, we own the equipment. Yeah, it's already paid for by our pioneers. Thank you to them very much. Yeah.
Okay, and then is everybody's name? This may be a ridiculous question. I have no idea. Is everybody's name on the lease?
No.
Or on the is
deed?
it? How does that work? Yeah, on the deed, rather.
Right. No. We are 501D, I think. It's a tax. I might have got that wrong. I ought to know. It's a tax status that's a bit like monasteries. So the whole property is owned collectively by the body that, what to say?
Right, by the community. So it's a non-profit organization that's...
Yeah, we're not actually a non-profit, but it is a kind of corporation. Okay. So the whole property is owned by Twin Oaks community, and anybody who's a member can live here and benefit from that. And when you leave as you arrived. You can't take a piece of it with you.
Right, yeah. I guess that was kind of a question I had too, was how... I don't know. It's so interesting thinking about it from the perspective that I have. You've been living there for 20 years, and I'm very interested in farm collaborations. And this is a very large one, and it's beyond a farm. It's a whole community and a whole bunch of different projects that all generate revenue. And it's hard for me to I'm finding it hard for me to wrap my brain around not owning a piece of it. Was that difficult for you when you got there?
No, it wasn't, because I'd done that before. And, right from when I left college, I thought, like you're saying about collaborative farming and cooperation, I thought that is what I wanted to do, because I didn't relish the idea of being a solo farmer and having all that responsibility. And I didn't have the wealth to buy land myself outright. So getting together with other people to do that seemed to make sense to me. And, when somebody arrives here, they benefit from an enormous amount of what people before have provided. And you learn a lot of useful skills, you make a lot of great friends, you live in a wonderful place. And if you decide it's time to leave, you go, and that's it. You take your skills with you, and you keep up your friendships if you can, but you don't benefit anymore from all the wonderful things about living here. That seems, I don't know, I'm okay with that. I really believe in wealth equality, and that everybody should get an equal chance to come here, and not just people who have some money. You know, you don't have to buy your way in or anything to join Twin Oaks. You just have to fit in well socially and work-wise. And yeah, do your share. Don't spend more than your share of the money. Be nice to people. Be pleasant to be around, and that's all that's needed. You don't have to have a certain amount of money. And I really value that politically. I think it's important to do that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's really interesting just thinking about how much more power we have as groups.
Yes.
So I think about, you know, like a tractor, for instance, a very expensive investment. But if you had 4 or 5 people who kind of went in on it, you know, then it becomes obtainable, and then you could utilize it in so many different ways. All those implements would suddenly be less expensive.
Right.
And you know, extrapolate that out to be anything that you're doing. If you go in on it with several people, it becomes more achievable. You have more hands to help you build or whatever. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. We can do a whole lot more, and we have a whole lot more options by combining together. Yeah.
And then when somebody wants to, you mentioned somebody spending their fair share. When somebody wants to buy something, is there a process there that is in place that they have to go through a certain source first, or is everybody kind of allocated to a certain amount of spending cash? How does that work?
Everybody gets a monthly allowance. I actually don't know how much it is at the moment. It was $100, but it's gone down recently a little bit. So you can spend that more or less on what you like, so long as you are not buying a thing that you're kind of waving in front of people and saying, look, I've got this new laptop and you don't have one, or something like that. We don't want to be in each other's faces about any inequalities. So you can buy what you like with your $100 or whatever it is, however much it is. And then the community provides, you know, if you need clothes, we have a big room called community clothes or commie clothes. You can go there and look for clothes that you'd like to wear, and you can take those and use those as long as you like. We have a lot of shared resources. We have a wood shop where you can go and get some nails and screws and borrow a hammer and a screwdriver and go make things. We've got a sawmill that is mostly for making the hammock stretchers, but also cuts up and makes boards out of trees that our forestry crew cuts down that are dying or in the way or something, or to thin out the woods sustainably. You can get wood, you can get nails and screws, and you can make things for your room. You can go to the kitchen and make yourself a cake, whatever, you know, there's lots and lots of resources that everybody benefits from.
Wow, it's funny because at this moment, you know, I obviously like kind of called you to talk about agriculture, and
Right.
and I find myself asking you a lot of questions about the community.
Right.
But I think that's also, and I'm unapologetic about that. I'm
Oh.
obsessed with community farming. So, but at the same time, I feel like it seems sort of inseparable from what you're doing. You know,
Yeah.
that all of these things are a big portion of, you know, the farm is not. You can't really separate that from all the other pieces.
Right. Yes, it's true.
And is that something, I mean, you talked about wanting to find something like that when you were getting out of college, or is this kind of what you'd imagined?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I mean, it turns out that I like living with 100 people. I like sitting down to have lunch with some people, working with some different people, playing Scrabble with someone else, going for a walk with someone else. I like having that diversity of people around for my social scene and not have to drive into town or anything.
Yeah, and it's probably also got to be nice in terms of just work that you have other people that you can rely on should you get sick or get hurt.
Oh, yes. In our dining hall, there's a cork board. It's called the Today board. And if you're going to be too sick to do your work, you can post a card and say, "Oh, I'm too sick to do this job. Can someone else cover it?" And usually someone else will sign the card. Yeah.
Can you describe, I forget what you call them, but the labor credits, can you describe those a little bit? Can you describe those a little bit in more detail, how those are distributed and how that works?
Yeah. So every week, each member fills out a labor credit sheet for the coming week with the jobs that they would like to do or the ones that they've pre-committed to do. Like if someone always milks the cows on Wednesday mornings, they'll write that on their labor credit sheet. And then we put those in a box on Sunday, and then the person who's the labor assigner for that week takes all the sheets and all the list of jobs that need to get covered that's in a file, and they match up the jobs that need to get covered with the people that are available and willing. And then they put those labor sheets with the new jobs added onto them in another box, and we look at that on Wednesday afternoon, Thursday morning, and we see if we are agreeable to it or if we suddenly remembered we're going to the dentist on Friday or something, or we changed our mind. And if we've changed our mind or for some reason, we get this chance we call revisions, where you mark the sheet and you write in the back, "Oh, sorry, forgot I have a dentist appointment on Friday. Please take me off the garden shift," or whatever it is. So then the labor assigners do their best to rearrange things to fit all that. And our labor weeks actually run Friday to Thursday, which takes a bit of getting used to, but now just seems normal to me. So on Friday morning, you pick up your new labor sheet for the new week, and you see, well, you've already had a chance to look at it before, but you take that away and you work with what you've got. And if you can't do one of the jobs, you would post a card and say so and try and get someone else. But ultimately, you're responsible unless you're really, really sick. And then at the end of the day, hopefully, some people don't do it as often as this, but you keep track of the hours you work. So if you work 3 hours in an office doing some answering the phones or something, you write that down. For 3 hours, you write down an hour and a half of washing dishes. You write down 4 hours of working in the garden. You just write it all down and the time it took, and you add it up each day. And then at the end of the week, you add up the whole week's worth, and you turn in your labor credit sheet. Hopefully, you will have worked at least the quota that's required. If you've worked extra, it goes into your labor balance that rolls over from week to week. And so you're building up a positive balance, and then you can take some time off, some days off, or go on vacation as much as you've earned, whenever you want, whenever you can get your jobs covered. Okay.
And forgive me if you said this, but you're generally, like, the quota's roughly 40-hour week. Would that be accurate, or is it more than that?
It's more than that, but we're covering not just income earning work, we're covering domestic work like the washing of the dishes and taking care of the children and the cooking the meals and all the kind of things. Back when Twin Oaks was started, they really wanted to emphasize that domestic work is as important as earning money. At that time, it was, it's a strong tenet of feminism that domestic work should be valued as highly as any other kind. And so we do that.
That's great. And I think that's really important because I think about that a lot with my own wife, who does an insane amount of work. Just around the house or, with the kids or.
I bet.
And and then it's hard to, I guess, in some ways, like, put the right amount of value on that. But I love the idea of having that be part of the labor credit, because it's super important work.
Yes, right. We couldn't farm if we weren't well fed.
Yeah, 100%. Or the kids are not taken care of, or things aren't kept orderly, or whatever it may be. I think that's a really critical piece.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Pam Dawling, this has been an insightful and wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. You're very welcome. And if people want to know more, I do have a website. I just want to mention I have a website, sustainablemarketfarming.com, and I do a blog post once a week, and you can read it there, and you can read about my books. other stuff.
And those blog posts are excellent. I will make sure to point people there.
Thanks very much.
All right. If you enjoyed that episode, make sure to check out some of Pam's work at sustainablemarketfarming.com. You can also find a lot of it at Growing for Market magazine. You can also follow Twin Oaks Community on Instagram and Facebook and all the places. And I hear from a little birdie named Pam that they are also looking for new members. So check that out. We'll load these show notes with some awesome links for all those good things. Also, make sure you are subscribed to this podcast wherever you're getting it. We just hit 150,000 downloads, which I don't know. Considering I thought like 10 people would listen to this podcast, I think that's pretty good. Please subscribe, share it with your friends, and have them subscribe. Still, tons of people have no idea that there's this entirely new way of growing food, which is generally easier, is more ecologically sound. I think I'm rambling. Anyway, I really appreciate your support, and you can show your support over at patreon.com/farmerjesse, or you can always just kick us a few bucks to @NoTillGrowers on Venmo. That helps me to pay more people to help me do this thing. So also check out that event at notillgrowers.com/events, EVENTS. Offer code Jared Wright, JAREDRIGHT, 10% off through the month of December. Hope to see you there. Otherwise, thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yeah. And we're open to new members.
Oh, and you're open for new members. I should let people know that.
Yes, put that in too. Yeah.